I would first like to thank the permanent mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for hosting the in-person component of this event. And I'm happy to cede the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Faya Ajibli, Deputy Representative, and to Ms. Natalia German, Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of CTED, for their respective opening remarks.
So, Madam ASG, Madam Natalia German, everyone around the table and everyone online, welcome. It's really a full house at our mission, and also wonderful to hear that so many people are also joining online. This brings a lot of joy and pleasure to our mission, and again, a very warm welcome. We are especially also honored to co-host this event together with CTED. CTED is an invaluable partner for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and we also support. I've been to many meetings on counterterrorism, and one of the recurring messages that I come across, of course there are many, is really that we must target the terrorists' financial flows in order to effectively combat violence, terrorism, and extremism. And obviously, you all know this is much easier said than done, especially because terrorism financing has become increasingly sophisticated and complex. And I think a good example is the extent to which terrorism financing and transnational crime become increasingly intertwined. And also with the increasing diversity that we see with regard to financial transactions and evolving payment technologies and services, the collaboration between public and private entities has become integral in dealing with these financial crimes. And that is really significant and necessary. And of course, this also includes the financing of terrorism. And really, from the side from the Netherlands, we really believe that we cannot sufficiently stress its importance. And I'm sure today at this event, it will be adequately addressed. We also welcome the new Analytical Brief by CTED. It has a very long title on establishing effective public-private partnerships on countering the financing of terrorism. It says it all, I must say. My colleagues and I very much look forward to hearing more, learning more about how to make public-private partnerships function more effectively, efficiently, and responsibly, especially in the context of countering the financing of terrorism. And of course, we're also more than glad to share our experiences, the Dutch experience, so to say, and see how we can learn more from you and maybe sync and interact more. So I really would like to wish you a very successful event. I must say, because this was the last moment to move to our mission, I need to go towards 10:30 to another meeting. So if you see me go, it's not because I'm not interested. I'm very much interested, but my colleagues are here and will report back. I wish you a very successful event. And thanks again for coming, and also especially Madam ASG.
Thank you very much once again, and now ASG German for opening.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is also a great pleasure for me, first of all, to say thank you to our dear colleagues from the permanent mission of the Netherlands, to the United Nations, and especially to dear Madam Ambassador Faya Ajibli, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations. I also want very much to acknowledge the contribution of Ms. Nigina Alemeyer, who was the counterterrorism focal point at the Dutch mission. Thank you very much, first of all, for that great partnership and cooperation that CTED enjoys with the Kingdom of the Netherlands and with the permanent mission over here. And of course, for coordinating the joint launch of this event. And as other participants, I'm also very much looking forward to learn more about the Dutch experience, because I know there will be also case studies discussed and examined today. So this is also an extremely valuable contribution to our event. And I also want to welcome all the participants who gathered here today in person and those online. It is indeed a very impressive turnout, and that only testifies to the relevance and importance of the topic of our discussion. And of course, I'm sure it will bolster our collective engagement with the private sector, other relevant stakeholders in countering the financing of terrorism. And as terrorist financiers exploit various tools across and within private sector industries, effective public-private partnerships constitute a critical aspect in the global fight against terrorism financing. This is particularly recognized in the Resolution 2462, as the Security Council encourages competent national authorities to establish effective partnerships with the private sector, in particular with regards to the evolution of trends, sources, and methods of financing terrorism. And cooperation with the private sector is also emphasized by the Counter-Terrorist Committee throughout its 2022 daily declaration on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. So while larger banks and money or value transfer services have traditionally been the major providers of information reported under the anti-money laundering and CFT frameworks, an increasing number of fintech, internet, and social networking services, as well as non-financial economic sectors involved, for example, in natural resources exploitation, extraction, mining, pharmaceuticals, real estate, and constructions, has also become an effective but often underestimated source for detecting the movements of funds belonging or destined to terrorists or terrorist groups. And social media companies and other non-financial online services have a role in monitoring fundraising patterns and financial communications, which can be vital complementary information to collecting information on clients and their networks by related financial institutions. Public and private sector institutions can be a source as well as the target of information flow. And sharing information provides financial institutions and relevant competent authorities with intelligence, analysis, and data necessary to prevent and combat terrorist finance. Many private sector institutions look to the public sector to share information on trend analysis, patterns, behavior, targeted suspects, or geographical vulnerabilities in order to better manage their risk exposure, monitor their transaction flows, and provide a more useful input to law enforcement. And indeed, the appropriate use of the information they can generate can contribute to better identification of terrorist risks, tracing of assets, mapping of terrorist-related transactions. Proactive sharing of relevant information through PPPs can enable the early identification of threats, and they may also be mechanisms to address information exchange that requires immediate and urgent action. In the context of CFT, such cooperation is not without challenges, and I would like to highlight just a few of them. In the course of its dialogue with the member states, CTED has noted that many states still lack clear PPP frameworks, both legal and operational, to share terrorist financing related data and expertise between public and private sectors in a timely and effective manner and in compliance with relevant human rights standards, in particular rights to data protection and to privacy. And secondly, the existing public-private partnerships tend to focus primarily on working with traditional financial institutions. Non-financial sectors are often overlooked as our key partners in this field. And on the other hand, more inclusive partnerships with a wider range of stakeholders have proven helpful to make PPPs work in the current landscape of the financial industry. Another common challenge to effective PPPs on CFT matters is inadequate investments in their material, financial, and human resources, both in private sector and governmental authorities, including financial intelligence units. The establishment of trust and confidence between public and private sectors is also a major challenge, but it is also absolutely fundamental in this fight. And in the past 2 years, CTED itself benefited from the expertise brought in by private sector partners in the context of CFT, notably with respect to new payment and fundraising technologies that are abused for terrorist financing purposes, as well as innovative solutions and technologies to counter such abuses. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists and participants representing various perspectives, including from national authorities, research and academia, private sector, civil society, who will collectively reflect on how to encourage more effective and responsible private-public partnerships within the specific context of CFT. And by bringing diverse stakeholders and experts, CTED aims to foster a more sustainable, inclusive, and innovative approaches to public-private partnerships in the area of countering the financing of terrorism. Now, dear colleagues, dear participants, it is also my great pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Svetlana Martinova, who is CTED Senior Legal Officer and Coordinator on Countering the Financing of Terrorism, our moderator today, and of course, the coordinator of our recent analytical product that we are so proudly launching together today. And Svetlana will give now an overview of the key findings in our analytical brief. And of course, then Svetlana will be further inviting our experts to contribute also. Many thanks, and the floor is yours, Svetlana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman and the representative, Your Excellency. Just before I go to the substance, I'm making sure that we are good, heard and seen online, because I understand some participants have some concerns, but we have this under control, and hopefully we'll be able to help. Actually, as G. German has already referred to a lot of the important issues and findings noted in the brief. So in the interest of time, I will just give a couple of very quick bullet points on this. Of course, the opening line is that there are a vast variety of forms of these partnerships. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And the main message that we want to protract and send here is that, of course, partnerships go beyond what we see typically as obligations of reporting entities. This is the dynamic is very different. We've also noted the sensitivities that are related specifically to the CFT context, which is also often treated as a matter of national security. So partnering with a wide variety of private sector or other sectors is sometimes challenging for the authorities. Even when these practices are established, we still observe a lack of clear frameworks and platforms to do that regularly and consistently. We often see a one-way communication when the information is just channeled and provided without getting the feedback and how this information can be used, and misaligned expectations on both sides. We've also observed, sadly, insufficient attention to unintended consequences of sharing information without proper safeguards. And what we, I think, all will highlight during this event is the need for inclusive and multi-stakeholder approach. Hence, we take pride in having so many perspectives gathered today. And that actually was our effort to make sure that we ourselves do what we preach and include all the relevant stakeholders. We will divide the conversation with our panelists and discussants in two parts. First, focusing on the current state of affairs in the area of private-public partnerships, which we will refer to as PPPs in CFT. So this abbreviation you will hear consistently throughout the event. We'll take stock of known good practices, frameworks, and existing platforms, and the challenges that we are already aware of. And after that, I will invite our participants to reflect on the way forward, while also noting the outcomes of the first part of the discussion. So for the first part of the conversation, we have a panel of experts who are joining both online and in the room. The first is Martin Pilt, Senior National Advisor on CFT and Sanctions within the National Prosecution Service in the Netherlands. If we could please spot Martin online. In this capacity, he is program leader of the National CFT Interagency Cooperation of 13 government organizations, the FEC program on CFT. In addition, he chairs the Dutch Terrorism Financing Task Force, which is precisely the innovative public-private partnership on CFT. In addition to his impressive national experience, Martin is also the co-chair of the FATF Risk Trends and Methods Group, in which CTED has the pleasure of being closely involved. Second in the room, we have Surgeon John Chapman, who is a highly experienced 21-year veteran of the New York City Police Department. Can we have Surgeon Chapman on Zoom? Okay. When he starts speaking, it will happen. His experience with NYPD includes the Counterterrorism Division Elite Training Section, and since 2022, he supervises the NYPD Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau's public-private sector partnership known as NYPD SHIELD program. We also have in the room with us Dr. Benjamin Vogel, Senior Researcher from Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law. He recently concluded a European Union-funded project aimed at developing a legal framework for public-private information sharing in the fight against money laundering and the financing of terrorism. The report has just been freshly published and will be shared in the chat and through our resource page. He also led a multinational research group on exploring ways to improve the European legal framework against illicit financial flows and regularly advises policymakers and authorities across the EU on these topics. Next, also in the room, we have Ms. Chania Laking, Regional Programs Coordinator from the Global Center on Cooperative Security. She is actually based normally, unless she comes visit us in New York, in Nairobi, in Kenya, where she runs charge of technical assistance and program management on CFT across 6 countries situated in West, Greater Horn, East, and Southern Africa. We also have Mr. Loy Alakwa from blockchain intelligence expert from TRM Labs. In the room, we're happy to welcome you, and he leads counter-terror financing efforts at the company as part of the threat intelligence team. He has more than 12 years experience in counter-terrorism space, both in the private and public sector. And prior to joining TRM, Loy was the lead counter-terrorism analyst in the threat intelligence company Flashpoint. Last but not least, online with us, if we can turn to Mr. Volko van Deventer, the co-founder and deputy director of the Human Security Collective, also associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. And Volko has been working with government, civil society, and the financial sector to strengthen the dialogue on CFT and mitigate unintended consequences on CFT for non-for-profits. That is our first panel. It took a while to just introduce everybody. So I will also take a moment to introduce the CFT team who worked on the brief that we are actually discussing. Next to me, Ms. Priti Saburo, in front of me, Ms. Tanako Emoto, and also a former member of our CFT, Angela Bonasso, at the table back there. She actually started the work on the preparatory interviews and reached out to some of you in the process. We also have some participants online who will join this segment in addition to the main panel. We will all try to remain very brief and sharp and on point. And first of all, to set the scene, as we've heard from the remarks of ASG Airman, we know that There are some challenges. While the need for cooperation increases, there are still some challenges to frame this properly. While in some countries there are practically legal impediments for the law enforcement and private sector meaningful interactions, in other countries it's almost too flexible and too permissive, and the safeguards are missing. So to set the scene on the regulatory considerations, I would invite Dr. Berger to please point out the key outcomes of his recent research on this with respect to legal and regulatory considerations.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, we just finished the previous work on developing the framework with emails here in the EU, and I'm happy to publish them today. Just to begin with, I think it's important to explain briefly the relevance of CFTP. In the end, it's about particularly operational identifying visual cause and CFT relevant risk, identify networks, and in the end, monitoring. So therefore, we focus in our recommendation on operational sharing, technical information sharing, and I think it all comes down to understanding that, of course, the public sector themselves is not able to police financial markets on its own, but also the private sector has shown its limits in policing effectively without more information from the public sector. Four challenges were particularly important for us in our work. The first is the lack of legal frameworks. So often there's no legal framework for operating in the private sector in countries, in particular when it comes to voluntary cooperation. We see that it is not clear what authorities are allowed to share information. It's often also not clear what the private sector is allowed to do in terms of processing its customer data. In this, it's important to point out that the AML CFT framework, as it stands today globally, is usually not providing a good legal base, because it was designed to one-way information flow from the private to the public sector. What happens with cooperation PPPs is that the private sector becomes more of a corrective intelligence gathering tool of the authorities, and that is something that has to be addressed. Closely related to this is then the second challenge, which is the depth of the intelligence covering that is possible through these. Authorities can get very deep insights into the private lives of customers, making this a very intrusive exercise. Third, the issue of de-risking. Of course, if authorities single out individuals and entities in their customer base, this is a strong incentive to get rid of these customers together. And fourth, we see that regulated entities often are afraid of providing sanctions if they continue a business relationship with individual entities that were flagged by the authorities, even if there's not necessarily yet evidence of criminal wrongdoing. So if we see these points together, what needs to be done? I think we can stress 3 points of particular relevance. First, developing legal frameworks where legislators need to define to what extent the private sector should be allowed to be part of correctly gathering intelligence from authorities and define the limits of private sector is allowed to do in this respect. Second, one needs to develop safeguards appropriate to the intrusiveness of this intelligence gathering, which means in particular there needs to be effective and independent oversight. And third, it's also important to make sure that there are rules in place so that the private sector cooperating with the authorities is not afraid to provide sanctions if they continue business relations on behalf of investigating authorities or intelligence agencies. That would be my opinion.
Thank you very much. I think we're still experiencing some challenges online. Let me know if it gets better or worse as we're trying different solutions as we go ahead. Yeah, I think. Are there any improvement right now? Yes. Okay. So it seems that you need to get much closer to the mic, like I am now, when you speak. So just please bear that in mind. And thank you very much for your setting the scene remarks. It's very important to understand where we are in the legal sphere. We will now zoom in on the existing and seemingly successful platform that operates in the Netherlands. So I will just pause for a second until we put Martin on the spot. Yes. Martin, could you please share with us what you think are the most important strengths of this platform and what makes it effective? Are there still any challenges to address as you observe the experience?
Yeah, thank you, Svetlana. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. And thank you for the invitation. And I really want to thank and congratulate CTED and, of course, the Netherlands for being an excellent host and facilitating this analytical brief and the launch of it. So what are we in the Netherlands trying to do in our PPP? And let me a quick remark before I start. It's that it's about cooperation in the stage of intelligence information. So it's not the cooperation that we have within our criminal investigations, because then we can use our criminal law to claim for information. In the Netherlands, we started a PPP with public parties, our national police, our tax police called the Field, FIU the Netherlands, and our prosecution office service, together with the four main banks in the Netherlands. And it's, well, very quick. The idea is simple. We made a combination of two legal frameworks that we have in the Netherlands. We have our police information law, and there is the possibility to share operational information with third parties. Then you have to, there must be a necessity in connection with an urgent public interest to share this information. So that is one. And secondly, we have our Prevention Act in prevention of money laundering and terrorism financing. And that's basically our law about transaction monitoring for private sector and reporting unusual transactions to our FIU, the Netherlands. So these two existing legal frameworks, we made a combination of it, and that's in a key, the principle of our task force. We have some data protection measures also to reduce the privacy impact of this partnership as much as possible. This task force, the working group, is a so-called closed box. So the information that's shared, it stays within this group, and in the group there are not every bank employee or analyst is able to enter this the systems and this group, so it's a closed box. We have a covenant, a work instruction, and we did a privacy impact assessment, and that's how we started this this task force. There are three stages. The stage of input, that's tactical operational information from our law enforcement agencies who are involved in countering terrorism or terrorism financing. So that the public part, these law enforcement agencies, we have information about foreign terrorist fighters, facilitators, recruiters, potential attackers. The information, its names and some context information is provided to the analysts in the closed box working group. Then when the information is there, they start their monitoring task, and when they find something unusual in the transactions, they report it to our FIU. And the FIU is, so these banks are in the same room, on the same location, and the FIU is in the same room as well. And then the FIU takes the information separately, and our FIU can declare an unusual transaction suspicious and provide it to law enforcement again. So that's in fact, this is how the task force works. And in the majority, talking about the results and the effectiveness of this task force, the majority of the cases that emerge from our task force have an added value. So these STRs, suspicious transaction reports, have an added value to both our terrorism investigations and also our terrorism financing investigations, and even other kind of investigations in, for example, fraud or money laundering. The quality, the timeliness, and the impact of the reports really improved, and that's also, I think, because of the analysts of the banks working together with FIU within the legal possibilities. So it helps our financial institutions to monitor more effectively and more targeted than they would do when we didn't provide this information to them. So in that way, it's also more proportional. And of course, we have some challenges. I think we need clear rules about how private parties may process the data on behalf of the authorities. And we need also rules or mechanisms to ensure that the PPP do not expose private parties to inappropriate sanctions risk, or by supervisory, or for public parties, the risk to harm a criminal investigation becomes too strong. And what we are now also working on is what we call the feedback loop. That's both on sharing knowledge and themes and more general feedback from the working group, but also in case level. And that's more difficult because when a case comes to law enforcement, it can take a long time before it will be in the newspaper that we are investigating someone. So that's difficult to realize, but we are working on it. And I think a good feedback loop is good to see the effectiveness of your task force, and it also motivates the analysts in the working group. And we are also looking for, because the landscape on terrorism financing constantly changes, so we are also looking for new private parties to join us. So that's in a nutshell how it works in the Netherlands in our TF task force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's our host country for today's event. So you had an extra couple of minutes there. But we're now moving to our physical host in terms of city and in terms of where we are located in the headquarters. So I'm pleased to give the physical floor in the room to Sergeant Schopman. Could you tell us briefly, because I know it's a very large and successful PPP platform operating on a broad range of counterterrorism issues, how the public-private cooperation has evolved in the almost 20 years since the program is in place, and can actually be used for CFT-specific purposes? Thank you, and I hope the sound is better now.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce NYPD Shield for anyone who isn't familiar with it. Post 9/11, the commission report obviously cited several failures with information sharing, and those critical failures could have led to the prevention of those attacks. So in 2005, we created the NYPD Shield Public-Private Partnership, essentially to increase the communication between the department and the private sector security realm. From there, in the last 18 to 20 years now, we've increased our stakeholders. on everything with the Texas nexus to terrorism as well. So essentially now establishing, maintaining, and enhancing those relationships allow us to get the feedback, as has already been mentioned, from our stakeholders. One initiative we just started about a year ago is the executive advisory committees. So besides the financial sector, as well as several other sectors, allowing an opportunity and an environment for like-minded security professionals to collaborate, communicate, and plan with security in mind. One of our strengths also is that we are a portal to all of the other NYPD assets, especially the Intelligence and the Counterterrorism Bureau. That includes the New York City Safe Hotline for suspicious activity reporting and threat reporting, our Joint Terrorism Task Force, our intelligence analysts, which recently worked on New York's most recent case of terror financing with Syrian terrorists through cryptocurrency as well, and our Sentry program and liaisons, which work across the world to allow us to investigate threats that originate outside of New York. One of our biggest strengths, however, is utilizing and exploiting technology to really answer this call and to fulfill this mission in seconds and minutes when it used to take weeks and days and weeks to do. But having our information sharing model be utilized, replicated, and shared around the world, we now have a global shield network, including a shield in Rotterdam as well. So having those resources increased and having that real-time information has allowed us to put out everything from indicators to tradecraft, warnings, threat assessments, and it's really helped us grow that relationship. And I think where it works best, not only is, as we cover more than just CFT, when we partner up in these collaborations such as this, it allows us to get that information, take notes, bring it back to our stakeholders as well, outside of the financial sector as well. So it's a force multiplier to educate and to make more situationally aware citizens around the city and around the globe. So far, it's been working pretty well. And, it's a simple mission, keep everyone safe all the time, everywhere, right? So it's very simple. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, and for keeping us safe. I would just emphasize for everybody, try to speak louder, because we have some participants who are struggling with the sound. For those online, if you miss something, we will post the recording that will have a clearer sound for sure. So we hope we will manage throughout the event. Now, as already mentioned by SG Gammon in her opening remarks, there are some cooperation channels that are more traditional and accepted, especially with larger banks who have been so far the major providers of information reported under AML-CFT frameworks. At the moment, an increasing number of fintech, internet, social networking services, and also other economic sectors like those involved in natural resources exploitation, extraction, mining, pharmaceuticals, real estate, constructions, and others that are not in all member states actually reporting entities as such. Those are still becoming more and more important for detecting the movements of funds belonging to terrorists or destined to them. With this thought in mind, I turn to Ms. Chanialaki and ask her to share how PPPs work in the African countries you are engaged in, especially with respect to these other economic sectors outside the formal financial sector, given the importance in the regional context. What successes, challenges you observe?
Thank you so much. Excellencies and colleagues. The global sector's CFT engagements across Africa emphasize the importance of engaging non-financial sectors in efforts to combat terrorism financing. With numerous national risk assessment sectors like real estate, second-hand car dealers, and dealers in precious metals and stones have been identified as high-risk areas of terrorism financing. Compounding this risk is the fact that some of these businesses operate informally and are not adequately integrated into the CFT architecture. And while they have certain obligations to comply with CFT risk mitigation measures, there is a lack of effective institutional and regulatory operational measures in place to ensure they are complied with. resulting in information gaps to share in the context of PPPs. Often there's little to no history of engagement between the supervisory authority and non-financial sectors, or it is unclear which supervisory authority is tasked with monitoring CFT compliance. In other contexts, the laws and regulations that impose CFT obligations are prepared by CFT experts without adequate consultation with non-financial sectors, and therefore not fit for purpose, given they don't reflect sectoral realities and cannot be effectively implemented. For example, the term pillars and precious metals and stones may not be an industry-recognized term, but not cater for the multifaceted operators, leaving businesses uncertain to whom the regulations apply. This is further compounded by the fact that these sectors often lack a professional association that can provide centralized contacts and dissemination ways. There often is no comparable bankers association that can be leveraged to facilitate wider sectorial engagement. Real estate agents are a common example of this on the continent. A third point I want to emphasize is that PPPs are complicated and time and resource intensive. Too often they become a one-way channel of information from the private sector to government. There needs to be clear legal parameters for the multi-directional sharing of information and for the oversight mechanisms to ensure that data protection privacy are adhered to. It is also critical that governments prioritize feedback to the private sector on the quality of information shared. By providing this feedback channel, law enforcement can guide the private sector to improve its detection and red flag capacities and improve the quality and quantity of actionable reports it receives. There are success stories to highlight on the continent. For example, Ghana has implemented nuanced strategies to advance PPPs, including by engaging with sectors prior to the enactment of specific laws, such that it's done with the Real Estate Agency Act 2020. The successes in these endeavors lies in encouraging unified collective voices within each industry, fostering collaboration and establishing a resilient foundation by identifying and mitigating risks and threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chania. It's a really important perspective to note in this conversation. And also, thank you for providing the text of your remarks, which we will publish very shortly, especially since we are encountering some technical issues now and then, apparently, not for all. But with this technology in mind, it's now high time to turn to the tools and expertise that the private sector itself can offer and hear how they work to support the authorities in detecting and suppressing terrorism activity. I turn to Loy from TRM Labs. The company is one of the renowned leaders in the global market today when it comes to blockchain intelligence and tracing complex transactions in virtual assets. Could you please share any examples of your partnerships on CFT with the authorities, and how does this work, especially given the cross-border investigations where several jurisdictions are involved?
Sure. Thank you, Svetlana. So to give a quick background, we focus on the use of cryptocurrency by terrorist groups, their supporters, and affiliated fundraising campaigns. And what we try to do is identify cryptocurrency addresses linked to these groups or campaigns. And then we see what we can identify in terms of transactions on the blockchain that can be potential disruption points for law enforcement. So sometimes we'll see funds coming from a cryptocurrency exchange or a cryptocurrency ATM that we know only operates in one country. In those cases, we'll flag this to the relevant law enforcement agency of that specific country. They can obviously subpoena that exchange or ATM company for more information about the user. Sometimes we also identify terrorist fundraising campaigns for nationals of a specific country or for terrorist activity in a specific country as well. And again, in those cases, we would flag that to the relevant law enforcement agencies. In terms of an example, I'll share one from last summer. A little over a year ago, we had identified a Tajik pro-ISIS fundraising campaign that was recruiting for ISKP being ISIS's affiliate in Afghanistan. So after identifying that campaign address, controlled by that campaign, we looked at the activity on the blockchain and noticed that they were cashing out at a common exchange. So what we did was we notified that exchange, and they launched their own investigations. They eventually notified the chief law enforcement, who then arrested a couple of individuals who donated to that campaign. Two of those were actually on their way to training camps in Afghanistan with their families. Eventually, the campaign operator himself, who was a senior recruiter and a member of ISAP, was located and arrested in Turkey. So it shows how multiple jurisdictions can come together. And I think this is one of the better examples of the power of blockchain intelligence and cooperation between both the private and the public sector. I think I mentioned as part of the question, what do we need from law enforcement? And the way we see it is the other way around, which is, how can we help them combat terror financing? How can we help them disrupt those activities? Whether that's sharing a lead with them or sharing some of the insights and the trends that we're seeing in the space. Because, like I said, ultimately we're here to help them disrupt those activities. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Soy, and also for providing such a really glaring example that has it all, the cross-border cooperation, very different jurisdictions involved, and very efficient outcomes. So thank you for that. Now, going back to what I said in the beginning, those kind of major challenges, we also found that where the terms of engagement are not sufficiently clear or are not evaluated in terms of their impact on protected rights, this might come with a range of unexpected consequences, including with respect to privacy and data protection, or some discriminatory profiling practices, de-risking, and denial of financial services. I therefore turn to Folco, who could probably share with us some observations from the civil society and NPO perspectives in this regard. And what would be your main recommendations as to how these negative consequences be mitigated or avoided altogether, ideally?
Good morning. Can you hear me, Svetlana?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, good day, everybody. Wishes from The Hague. Special thanks to CTED for organizing this relevant and very timely briefing session. Seeing the time going straight into the heart of the matter, detecting terrorist financing by PPPs practically means exchanging personal data of suspect terrorists. And it assumes that there's a democratic and legal basis for governments to exchange data with the gatekeepers and also accountability. But increasingly, we evidence abuses of the structures, mechanism, and instruments, both intended and also unintended. The question is, which personal data of suspected terrorists is exchanged within the PPPs, and how is the selection made? What are the consequences for the person concerned, and how are errors dealt with and corrected? Most PPPs are black boxes in this concern, and as there is no transparency or reporting on these matters in public so far. If we look at the broader counterterrorism architecture, in which the global counterterrorism strategy plays a very important role, we see that the upholding and respecting of human rights is very crucial to effectively counter terrorism. And we learned that counterterrorism strategies that violate human rights are counterproductive, increasing the support base for terrorism instead of stopping them. It's very interesting that the CFT domain seems disconnected from these lessons in the broader counterterrorism domain, and there seems very little to no attention to prevent terrorism financing. Probably because from an AML CFT perspective, the focus is on crime fighting and not so much on addressing root causes of violent extremism and terrorism. But the reality is that the stakeholders of the CFT PPPs and the mandates under which they operate are predominantly in the crime fighting arena and are mostly concerned about effectiveness in the short term. To strike the balance and build in the lens of prevention, human rights, privacy and data protection and proportionality should be an intrinsic and structural part of the PPPs. And stakeholders who can safeguard these aspects should have a core role and not just an outsider oversight role as occurs as best. How this should be institutionalized is different for each jurisdiction and should be carefully worked out in PPP frameworks in a contextual base. In striking the balance, the risk-based approach doesn't need to be a contradiction here. It should give ample opportunities for mainstreaming human rights and data protection into CFT strategies and mechanisms. In line with the recommendations from, as you know, the CRAFT project, and especially the study on ethics and good governance on PPPs in the realm of CFT that was issued last year, it is important to monitor and report on the impact of PPPs on fundamental rights of citizens and legal entities structurally, and to build in tools to adjust when the balance gets disturbed and ethics get out of sight. Acknowledging the great amount of speakers, I stop here and I hand back to you, Svetlana. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Volko. Very sharp and to the point. I know that Dr. Vogel had a brief comment on this point. Please go ahead, and then we have two more from the virtual floor.
I hope you can hear me. Yes, indeed, in our research, it has also been very clear that using similar measures like raising fees as red flag customers compensate additional CDP costs is really potentially the primary challenge piece. So the conclusion must be therefore for us that there must be very clear rules set by authorities how the information that the private sector receives is used by the private sector, and these rules must also be enforced, and there must be mechanisms in place that any other violation of these purpose limitations is detected and sanctioned, and that there are mechanisms also in place that information does not fall into unauthorized hands. However, one of the most important remedies we can think of in designing a legal framework for PPPs is indeed also to provide for notifications of targeted individuals once such a notification does no longer endanger a criminal investigation, so that affected individuals have remedies if they are unlawfully singled out and then be subjected to measures by regulated entities. So that is indeed a crucial element of our legal recommendations for the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vogel. At this very important juncture, I would also invite our good partner who is in the virtual audience today with us, Mr. Nicholas Miller, Senior Legal Advisor and Coordinator for Multilateral Engagement at the International Center for Non-for-Profit Law, to offer his brief remarks on this matter. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Svetlana. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. First, thanks to you, Svetlana, to CTED for making this opportunity available clearly to such a broad set of actors and sectors. It's, we think, a really good example of true multi-stakeholder discussion. On behalf of the ICNL Alliance, which is ICNL and ECNL, we want to appreciate in particular the references in the brief made to potential unintended consequences. And Svetlana, you've referenced those yourself, as have many of the speakers. Apologies, I have been able to hear most of the speakers well, so I hope that this is not duplicative. However, in looking at the unintended consequences, pointing in particular to one reference to them on page 18, the brief rightly notes that it is difficult for competent authorities not to share responsibility for the unintended consequences that are the result of private party actions. Unfortunately, the brief doesn't provide much guidance on how to handle such a situation. And we would suggest that it could be helpful to further articulate what that looks like. Volko made some excellent suggestions on that point. I heard some good practices from the Netherlands experience. But I think here, really it comes down to looking at human rights due diligence, both prior to in the design of these PPPs, but then throughout and sustained over the life of them. Here we'd like to say, and I anticipate this will be discussed further in the second half of this event, that these due diligence processes critically must be multi-sectoral and include in particular civil society In the CFT space, we've seen over and over again how unintended consequences can have dramatic effects on civic space writ large and on particular civil society actors or nonprofits. There are good guidance tools out there, the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, among others. But of course, if this were further articulated, there'd be many sources that could be pointed to. And I think as the brief itself points out, and as you said in your opening, Svetlana, it's often challenging for states to find the way to balance the different equities involved. So this particular point we think is worthy of more than just reference and acknowledgement in the brief, and probably requires further articulation through later CTED work. Lastly, sorry for going long, there is a particular way in which we think the UN should hear this point. This is not directed at CTED, but the CT architecture more broadly. We know that there's a project underway, also funded by the Netherlands, called GoFintel, which would promote public-private partnerships. And there we think would be a fantastic place to lead by example through including really meaningful, broad, and exemplary human rights due diligence that consults civil society before the public-private partnership is set up. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for this intervention. Very well noted, and we both know that we will meet soon virtually in another consultation on this topic in our work with the Global Compact entities on the guidance on human rights compliance while implementing CFT measures. We'll appreciate further thoughts and inputs there, so I think that it could be elaborated right there. We also have, Helen, I know I promised to turn to you next, but we will make one extra intervention here right before you from UN CTED, just to respond to Nicholas's question on GoFintel and his suggestion. Franz, if you can come in now, that would be great.
Well, hello everyone, and congratulations CTED and the team for this very timely product and briefing. I will respond on GoFintel as it was namely mentioned here. So we are actually developing this software for the use initially of the FIUs, but also in the future for any other law enforcement agencies. The software will improve analytical capacities in terms of investigating terrorist financing offenses and any other predicate offenses. So we have started last year some discussions with ECNL on the conduct of a human rights due diligence risk and impact assessments. So just to mention here that these considerations are well taken into account in the development of GoFintel, and including also in its future deployment within the FIUs of interested member states, being Netherlands at first. So the process is ongoing. So the hiring of the consultant is almost done. And we expect that 2 consultations will be organized this year on Q1 and Q2 with civil society and other interested stakeholders. And of course, this product will not only inform the development of the technical features of the software itself, but will also inform and put some guidance for us in whether we can actually get into negotiations with the member states, and to what extent the technical assistance package should look like in terms of the deployment. So voila, this is work in progress. I'm very happy and proud to say that this is the first UN developed product that will go into this process, and I'm really, really convinced that it's not an obstacle for us, it's rather than a tool. I always like to say that because I have seen many expressions of interest from countries that obviously are not fit for purpose. and doesn't mean that they cannot be granted the use of the software GovIntel, but means that we have a lot of work to do in advance. And this is why I'm so grateful for ECNL for being at the driver's seat in this. So we will keep you informed of the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a big echo, but I think it's now better. Yes. I thought it would be important to really provide this perspective since Nicholas also brought it to the table. So I really appreciate these clarifications. Before we move on to the next segment of our discussions, I would like to call on another expert in the virtual audience, Ms. Helen Alderson, a Senior Research Associate at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, for a few words on something that we have not specifically explored in our brief, but is definitely an important area to delve into. Namely, how these partnerships with financial institutions and other stakeholders can help mitigate adverse impacts on humanitarian work and ensure that money and other aid reach their lawful and intended beneficiaries in the CFC context. Helen, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to focus on this question of unintended impact that CET and also sanctions measures can have of actually hampering humanitarian action, notably through, for example, asset freezes, de-risking, and so on. And in this context, I'd like to make three very brief points. Firstly, there are a few countries, too few, actually, the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands seems to really be a place where there's a lot of best practice going on. These countries have ongoing roundtables, multi-sector, tri-sector working groups, they're called different things in different countries, which bring together government departments, financial institutions, not-for-profit organizations to find solutions really at a very practical level to deal with these unintended consequences. I'm not sure whether we can necessarily define these as PPPs, but that actually doesn't matter because these mechanisms are very useful. These are sectors that don't often or don't always talk to each other, that don't necessarily understand each other or even speak each other's languages. So simply sharing of information between different sectors is a first step in finding solutions. Yet it is just a first step. So these kinds of dialogues need to continue. They need to be even more inclusive. And also more resources should be put into actually monitoring implementation of recommendations that are made beyond the actual discussions. The second point that I'd like to make is that these tri-sector dialogues have been very much focused on sanctions. And so in this regard, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2664 provides for a humanitarian exemption in asset freeze measures across UN sanctions regimes. This is a really important resolution and marks huge progress, but it doesn't cover other counterterrorism measures, other measures in host and donor countries, which actually limits the impacts of this resolution. So I think the point here is that the partnerships that exist through these tri-sector groups and tri-sector dialogues should actually look at widening the current focus to include CT measures more systematically. This may make these discussions a little bit more unwieldy, as will probably involve including more stakeholders, but it's something that is really important in terms of actual impact. And then my final point is that this issue obviously transcends national borders as the solutions are international. And so I'm happy to say that ODI will be convening a series of international meetings, bringing these different sectors together. We'll be starting next month. And the idea is to be able to share best practices, lessons learned, and also to work towards aligning measures between different jurisdictions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. Very valid points, of course, take into consideration and maybe write another brief. On this, we are right in time to switch to the second part of our discussion. where we will try to look ahead and collectively reflect on what we can do better, in addition to what we've already mentioned. Since we are trying to cover so many issues in one event, and are talking about human rights, I thought it would be a good point to note that we will be violating human rights in terms of breaks. We do not have a break, but for those in the room, there is water, coffee, and tea at the back, so please feel free to refill your cups if need be. Meanwhile, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Michelle Fresher, who is in the room with us. If we can please. She is expert in the intersection of financial crime compliance and data privacy and protection. Michelle is also a former academic who has worked on regulatory technology in the regulatory technology space for the past decade, and is currently an independent consultant working, among others, with the EU Global AML CTED facility on their training programs. Dr. Fresher also co-chairs the Data Experts Group of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. We would very much like to hear from you, Dr. Fresher, in addition to the concerns that we've discussed in the first part, how to frame PPPs in CFT in a way that they are efficient, but also compliant with what we need to protect. What do we need to do better in achieving this balance?
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Svetlana, and thank you, CTED, for the invitation. As a lot of the other speakers have emphasized, the multi-stakeholder approach is extremely important. When these groups get down and talk to each other, I think they realize that there's a lot more shared interests than there are conflicts. That doesn't mean there aren't conflicts, but you can look at shared interests. To me, what I think we can do better is we can look at the data operations, get down to the data level, data elements that's actually being used here. And this is where we get into data privacy and protection, DPP. So DPP looks at the relevant data, the accurate data, data quality, transparency. And if all of this sounds familiar, well, it should, because in the private sector, you want to tweak your algorithms to be the best possible results, the quickest results at the cheapest and most efficient. So, of course, what that means is then you're giving better targeted reporting to authorities on, maybe entity level or trend. On the other side of the PPP aisle, you have the authorities who clearly want the best information possible to help their investigations or even give them more trends in the market, because these private sectors know their markets best, right? But they also share these topologies. And where the topologies are extremely important, they don't necessarily break those topologies up to the data layer. What data variables that I would put into, say, a technology system or a database, and how would I pull that out and recognize them to see this information? So if we're looking at this operational data level, we're going to get more effective PPP relationships, which means better results. You're going to have less money spent on all sides, hopefully better identifying people engaged in terrorism finance, protecting societies and individuals that should not be reported because they're not doing the things that they're not bad actors, and mitigate that de-risking. So really, it comes down to a cooperative dialogue from many different stakeholders, and I just don't mean data protection and privacy. I mean, how does technology work, database, the tech people, the IT side, as well as the policy, to have those conversations, create these data standards, core set of data standards at the very least, and then develop technology that supports those best practices. And that will help facilitate better data sharing as
well. Thank you so much, Michelle, for this very practical thoughts. And thank you very much for this very practical thoughts. And we will definitely, need again elaborate in this direction. I think there's a lot to be explored. We will now turn to our online participants, in particular Tom Keating. While he's being spotlighted, I will quickly introduce Tom. He is the founding director of the Center of the Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, where his research focuses on matters at the intersection of finance and security. He's also currently a specialist advisor on illicit finance to the UK Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee. CTED has enjoyed a long-standing cooperation with Tom, even before RUSI, when he was with JP Morgan, and I remember was in fact among our very first private sector partners back then. RUSI has issued several recent studies on public and private partnerships related to countering financial crime and CFT more specifically, including in the context of new technologies, and those will be shared in the chat and the resource page. What would you say remains the biggest and most commonly unaddressed challenge in this regard?
Great, Svetlana, thank you very much. I will answer your question, but because you referred to some history there, I will just point out that this is something that has featured, PPPs have featured in our work at RUSI for 10 years. It's the reason we were founded in 2014. The other thing I would point to is in the UK, we have something called the FinTech FinCrime Exchange, which, to the pertinent issue of tech and terrorist financing, is a community of fintechs that supports law enforcement and policymakers in the UK to try and get them to understand the vulnerabilities and the benefits of tech. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from the Comply Advantage guys. And lastly, I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Nick Maxwell, the future of financial intelligence sharing, which I would say is the preeminent thinker on PPPs. So where are we up to? Look, I mean, it's great to hear this conversation, and it's great to celebrate the work that CTED has done. But I think it's important just to think about a few basic rules if you want to succeed with PPP. So I think I can distill the CTED report down into 8 points, which I'll just run through very quickly. The first one is, let's remember what our objective is here, right? Our objective is to collaborate to identify and disrupt terrorist activity. And in doing that, we want to leverage financial intelligence to support counter-terrorism efforts. Our friend from the NYPD there will, I'm sure, agree with that. But we must make sure that these partnerships embrace new technologies. There's no point in having partnerships with just legacy finance when all the action is happening in the modern world, whether it's crypto, whether it's electronic money institutions, and the like. And the last thing I would say as a do is start small and grow. Much of what I hear about public-private partnerships is trying to shoot for the moon on day one. So look at what they did in Singapore. They started small, they grow, they now have a very impressive PPP in Singapore. So build within your legal and privacy boundaries. What should we not do? We shouldn't let an obsession with compliance obscure the mission. We are trying to identify terrorist financing. Let's focus on that and not get carried away with ticking boxes. A lot of talk about legal and privacy issues, unintended consequences, very important, but let's not let those unnecessarily get in the way of the mission. Don't ignore new market entrants. You won't be surprised to hear me say, given what I said just now, the finance industry has revolutionized itself in the past 10 years. And again, don't be overly ambitious. It will lead to disappointment. But PPPs can achieve a step change. I was part of the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force Terrorist Finance Working Group. It made a difference to combating ISIS threats in the UK in 2015, 2016. And so I would urge all member states to embrace the opportunities provided by establishing PPPs. Start small and grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, so much. Very, I can't add more. Very to the point. I think we can just replay that reporting at every occasion and summarize it into very practical points. You mentioned among very many other valid issues, the revolution in the fintech and financial services, but also related industries. And speaking of these technologies, and we heard in the previous panel from the TRM labs today, we are also pleased to welcome in the room Andrew Fearman, who is the head of sanctions strategy for Chainalysis, another big actor in the world of blockchain analytics. Andrew, what's the experience of Chainalysis identifying terrorism financing, especially where social media platforms are involved, and how we can work with the public sector to combat this?
Thank you for having me. Blockchain analytics plays a pivotal role in supporting the cryptocurrency ecosystem, whether through coordination with the public sector or helping enhance compliance programs with the private sector. We provide transaction monitoring tools that help compliant digital asset businesses detect abuse from bad actors. Transaction monitoring and investigative solutions are only as good as their underlying data, and therefore the identification and validation of terror financing is critical for this to be successful. The challenge, however, lies in the ability for blockchain analytics companies alone to differentiate between legitimate humanitarian aid, terror financing, and everything in between. When faced with limited information, particularly when examining social media sources, with no true identifying information, how should analytics companies proceed with a clear delineation between humanitarian support and terror financing? There's ethical dilemma in potentially blocking legitimate humanitarian efforts in efforts to curb terror financing, but there are equal risks in inadvertently processing terror-related activity. Furthermore, the blanket labeling of social media profiles as terror financing by private entities who lack the authority to make such designations can have far-reaching implications. Therefore, a multifaceted, risk-based approach that also leaves regulatory and ethical considerations with a commitment to factual accuracy and thorough verification is essential. This is where public-private partnerships come into play. They play a fundamental role in identifying, analyzing, and validating potential terror financing risks. Absent this collaboration, private sector firms may struggle to make informed, risk-based decisions, which could result in either mistakenly blocking legitimate funds or inadvertently allowing funds to reach the hand of terror organizations. Bridging this gap requires coordination between public and private sectors, with financial institutions, cryptocurrency exchanges, and blockchain analytics companies working together, contributing to lead generation and insight sharing to the public sector, while also the public sector confirms social media campaigns with potential terror financing risk. Such cooperation ensures that the financial ecosystem does not inadvertently support terrorism, while also facilitating the flow of legitimate, critical humanitarian aid to its intended recipients. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I will now turn back to TRM Labs and Mr. Mario Cosi that we have in the room. Mario manages a threat intelligence team there. And in addition to his experience with the private sector, Mario has over a decade of investigative experience, including with the US Army intelligence operations combating terrorism and providing analytical support to FBI financial investigations. Mario, does TRM share a similar experience as just mentioned by Andrew? And what's the main message you'd like to bring forward?
Thank you once again for having us here. One of the things that we're looking at moving forward with private-public sector partnerships is, as we see the financial space, it's rapidly evolving. And that's one thing that our threat actors are doing with the financial space as well, especially when we bring in blockchain analytics, blockchain into it. One thing that we see with our actors is threat actors is how they're moving forward in the space, and what makes them move forward and advance their techniques is going to be disruptions. We have a philosophy that we're looking at this type of activity that with every disruption, the remaining threat actors that are left out there are going to see it, and they're going to try to find some way to overcome it and advance it. So one thing with the partnership when it comes to this is that moving forward, we need to all work together to create a collaborative framework that focuses on creating assessments on how threat actors will react to disruptions. With these future assessments, we should focus on understanding and creating monitoring and detection mechanisms. Saying, hey, once this happens to a threat actor, they might potentially move to the financial state. They might potentially exploit this weakness. So we need to create a segment around that and then create those detection and monitoring mechanisms for it as well. Now, following that, once those are in place across the board, across all three, then it will enable us to identify that future activity, disrupt it once again, and then we complete that cycle again. So to conclude it, for every disruption out there, we must always anticipate an advancement and then be ready to target that advancement. Another thing that we're looking at here as part of another way moving forward, we need to maximize our capacity building, particularly in the forum when it comes to education. We have seen from one particular thing, especially in blockchain investigation, is there's a lack of education when it comes around tracing illicit activity in crypto, specifically terrorist financing in crypto. We have to build a capacity across the board using blockchain analytics companies like ours and Chainalysis, where we can enable investigators to continue to target this in this realm of cryptocurrency. Another one in the education realm is that within this public-private partnership is that we have to educate each other on our capabilities. There needs to be a complete understanding of our capabilities, including strengths and weaknesses. We can rely on each other's strengths to be more efficient in the space, be more effective in the space moving forward. So that education piece will definitely play a part in this partnership, and that is something that will help advance our techniques and then also help everyone disrupt terrorist activity in the future.
Thank you so much, Mario, and we do appreciate the partnerships with both Chainalysis and TRM that we have now for the past 2 years already. We really learned from you, speaking about education, but we're also passing on the message to member states when we work with them where the possible options and sources lie for that. So that's very useful indeed. Now, a few previous speakers have already referred to compliance issues, and in our brief, we noted that in the absence of adequate support and adequate framework for the private sector, financial institutions, and other service providers, they may tend to overcomply, to avoid risks, and use some de-risking practices. On the issue of compliance, we have with us several experts in the field, including Ms. Jacqueline Benz here in the room, Chief AML Sanctions Officer with the digital assets market. And also online, we have Andrew Davis and Ian Armstrong from Comply Advantage. So if I can ask first, Jacqueline, from your sector's perspective, what needs to be done to enhance compliance with the AML-CFT requirements in a balanced way without over-pushing in the direction?
First of all, thank you so much to Zita for the event today and for giving the private sector the opportunity to speak. I think I'd just like to start with saying that Mr. Tom Keating really summarized my remarks. So in terms of over-compliance, I think there's a delicate balance between over-compliance and de-risking. But what do public partnerships look like? So I'll have 3 quick points to add to the discussion. I think my colleagues here today from CRM and Chainalysis have a blockchain monitoring piece covered. And so we'll cover the perspective from a private sector digital assets company, how we manage this risk while also not over-complying. And so when we think about what public-private partnerships look like, we do need stronger coordination in the emerging blockchain ecosystem. And there's a spectrum of companies, right? Large crypto companies, and then really small emerging companies, potentially DeFi. And so the range of compliance and how to do it is very different. Even for the largest of companies, we've seen a number of enforcement actions. And for the smaller companies, sometimes they will apply a traditional financial institute template or just not comply. And then when we look at the smaller companies, some of them don't even fall under most country regulations. And so if you're a small fund that doesn't trade customer funds, prop trading firm, you may not even need to have an AML program. And so there's a major gap there in the type of business in addition to the jurisdictions. And I think addressing that's really important and a difficult discussion between the private sector and the public sector. The second point I wanted to highlight was this delicate balance between de-risking and compliance and not over-complying. Oftentimes, the best-in-class at this moment in time, as we see with the recommendations and some of the larger companies and what they implement, is typically applying a traditional financial institution structure to their compliance model, which this may be an unpopular opinion. So speaking personally on behalf of myself, I would say that may not necessarily be the best approach because oftentimes it leads to over-compliance and you're still potentially open to enforcement action. And so I think what is really important is continuing these discussions, really bringing smaller companies in so that they can share the lessons learned. On a variety of conferences I go to, each larger company chief compliance officer will ask, what blockchain monitoring vendor do you use? And they'll say all of them. And that's very expensive and that's really hard for an emerging smaller company. Similar to what Google did back in the day with CTED and the UN and supporting smaller companies to protect their platforms from terrorist use of the internet, such an approach is really needed to help these smaller companies emerging in this space because that's probably where terrorists are going to go, right? Where it's easiest to set up a account, easier to move money, potentially not even regulated or required to be regulated. And so, third point I wanted to cover was my favorite topic, KYC. So on knowing your customer, I think one thing that I've seen is the importance of pre-onboarding review. This could be a very rich discussion, potentially a later meeting one. Do you require a blockchain address from a customer prior to onboarding? So sort of historical data. Sometimes it's hard because customers will self-custody and you have fireblocks, new address each time there's a counterparty. But really knowing that blockchain space, which I think Andrew and Mario are much better here to reflect on, and we welcome their views on that, is really important because that's when you can really identify prior to any transactions taking place for customers. And then finally, on gaps in legislation. And obviously there's gaps in legislation between countries. We see a lot of smaller industries popping up where legislation, AML and CFT legislation is much weaker and primarily for business reasons. But that's very important to address. So in addition to really the private sector playing a role and CTED playing a role, I think member states can play an important role in really enhancing their legislation in line with FATF standards and also expanding it across businesses. Because there's so many loopholes in the type of business structure that you set up, or you won't be required to comply. And the goal is really to prevent terrorists from moving funds for illicit activity is really important, regardless of the business structure. So moving forward, really looking forward to continuing discussions on this and filling those gaps and loopholes in ways that don't result in over-compliance, but really address the distinct nature of the crypto ecosystem. Thanks for the opportunity today, and I'm looking forward to continuing discussions.
Thank you so much, Justine. Very much appreciate our continuing partnership in your various capacities since you have moved from our committee to the private sector and law. We will come back to some of the points you made, but before that, return to Andrew and Ian from Comply Advantage, the company that offers solutions with latest technologies to automate certain processes, including in identifying red flags and cross-checking with sanctions lists. What's your perspective on effective collaboration with respect to data, technology, and information sharing to realize the goal of disrupting terrorism financing?
Yeah, thanks, Svetlana, and thanks to CTED for organising this event, and most importantly, thanks to all of the participants in the event, because here we're talking about a collective effort to achieve that moral imperative that Mr. Tom Keating referred to earlier about stopping the financing of terrorism. And I don't say this as a generic platitude, but I was sort of sitting here watching the events and the engagement here, and I thought back to that John F. Kennedy quote where he's organised hosting a dinner at the White House and for Nobel Prize recipients, and he says, you know, this is by far the most incredible group of knowledge that we've ever hosted at the White House, maybe with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Now, I use that as a sort of an analogy to say that part of this process is that we've actually engaged private and public organizations here to achieve this moral imperative. Now, to come to your question, so we do see traditionally financial services and the use of financial services to fund the illegal terrorist activity has often just been seen as a sanctions screening problem. So we've had text, we've been interrogating text to try and uncover nefarious activity related to terrorist financing. But much like here, we're trying to take the power of the big brain and the collective to achieve the goal of stopping the funding of terrorism. We're treating this problem and with our customers and with things like the UK FinTech Financial Crime Exchange, we're actually trying to use the power of that network to fight this activity. And, you know, I want to reinforce some of the things that we've said previously around the financial service industry continues to evolve, undergo transformation, money moves more quickly around the world. We've got digital assets, we've got digital channels proliferating, and critically, the ecosystem of financial services companies is expanding through the evolution of things like open banking. And the system is only as strong as the weakest link. The system is only as strong as the weakest link. So let's think about that. And if you think about terrorist financing as a network problem, networks create connected data. The nodes in the networks can be participants in the ecosystem. They can be financial services companies. They can be you and I originating illicit flows. Law enforcement are involved in those networks. And with the appropriate protections on the data, as we've sort of commented earlier, some of the earlier speakers, we can use that collective data to uncover this nefarious activity. Data, and we at Comply, obviously, we provide different sources of data, but I'm thinking of data in this broad network of relationships and this broad interaction of events, which can include financial events, of course, but that data exists, and that's the fuel that drives the detection of terrorist financing. The data exists today, and then what we're doing in this sort of group of RegTech companies is using technology to draw together all of the information in these networks to really sort of uncover actionable insights to stop terrorist financing. So we can use these techniques like machine learning and AI on this data, on this network. And the idea is, you know, collectively, you know, we can detect this activity. And you know, I often think about this sort of in terms of, you know, that sort of call to action, I think, that Tom had earlier. You know, united we stand, divided we fall. We need to support that moral imperative in fighting terrorist financing. And that's part of our approach. And Ian has a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so as we've got this proliferation of data on both sides of the public and private equation, we're really advocating here for a more completionist view of that data to disrupt threats quicker as well as earlier. But that's one type of information sharing. And we really want to underscore what I believe Mario was saying earlier, is that information sharing shouldn't be seen as solely about the transmission of intelligence, specific data points around intelligence. There's a more straightforward form of sharing in the form of education. And we think that banks and software companies like ours, as well as other types of financial institutions, are more likely to have immediate visibility, let's say, of things like upcoming developments in payments innovation. So we know from past experience that terrorists are adept at using novel forms of payment and value transfer. We're also very, very close to developments in the application of machine learning and how that can be used to detect behavioral patterns. And it's relatively trivial for a company like ours to deliver education materials on subject like these for the benefit of the public sector, as we're already doing that for our internal staff. And I think we would extend an open invitation to any intelligence agency that was interested in hearing from us about that. So when national authorities are thinking about establishing new and better partnerships with the private sector, we just really encourage them to be bold and unambiguous about the areas where they would simply like to improve their understanding. I think Tom made the point that we really need to be outcomes focused, which is very in line with how technology companies see the world. There's a sort of philosophy in tech called jobs to be done. But let's be very clear that one of those jobs is educating each other on both sides of the public-private equation. And as Andrew says, let's always remember that we're in this collectively in support of that moral imperative to stop terrorist financing. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you both, and really I'm very glad to continuously note after each intervention that we do seem to be on exactly the same page all together, despite the different perspectives and backgrounds that we all represent, but we all seem to be in full agreement on where to go from here. Now, turning to our next expert, I just want to reflect that in several previous discussions and meetings where we participated, we heard from fundraising platform companies about community engagement, which is critical for understanding their clients and their networks. And their role in monitoring fundraising patterns and financial communications is complementary to the information that the financial service providers collect as they cohabit in the same process. And I think that goes back to some remarks that Justine made and also other speakers about coordination within different sectors and within different stakeholders. We have with us today Matthew Murray from GoFundMe, and he will appear online momentarily. There he is. So GoFundMe is a large crowdfunding platform that chose itself to self-regulate and avoid terrorism financing misuses, which is so far a unique experience in the crowdfunding space. Matthew, to ensure that you're not operating in silos, what support would you still need from the public authorities to ensure that you're doing your part right?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Svetlana, and thank you to CTED for hosting this panel. I think a lot of my fellow panelists have touched on this, and it really is driving towards that focus on mutual understanding and respect for operations. To the public sector, I would say to really take time to understand the private sector when engaging and be very clear with your goals and expectations. Ambiguity is not our friend here, and it will make your partnership more effective because nobody wants their business to be abused like this. And that is a fantastic starting point for a strong partnership. On top of that, really demonstrating the value that a PPP can add to a private firm along with the public good are all very solid strategies. As far as understanding the industry that you're working with, most crowdfunding platforms themselves are not financial institutions. And so it's very common that the platform itself will have very rich behavior insights, while the financial institution that powers their payments will actually have the payment data. Really understanding how to navigate this is crucial for a productive and efficient partnership. This has been touched on by several of my fellow panelists as well, but I'll really know that the hesitation from private sector is often more than often, I would say, is almost always out of consideration for customers' protected rights and privacy. To solve that, I would really encourage public sector to create safe harbors, clear mechanisms, and clear guidelines, along with clear protections and expectations for these partnerships. As alluded to earlier, this does not have to be complex. Finally, I would say to really focus on the activity of crowdfunding and not just on the platforms themselves. Any social media, any technology, any messaging app that allows you to share a bank account or a mobile wallet can be used as a crowdfunding platform, and that themselves will have unique risks and opportunities for partnerships. So I would encourage everybody to think expansively on this and really, really drive towards that mutual understanding and alignment on our shared goals.
Thank you, Matthew. Very clear and very important perspective here. And again, congratulations on the that you were doing with the caution and the attention that you've received. Before concluding this very rich discussion, I would like to invite our partners from international organizations to share with us what they're doing and will probably do more of now that they've heard all of these thoughts to support member states and the private sector in establishing clear, effective, and human rights compliant ways of cooperation in the CFT space. I will first go to UNODC and invite Ms. Melissa Tullis, Program Management Officer, to give us a brief overview on that.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. Thank you, ASG, Yaman, Svetlana, and David for convening this launch event and for elaborating this important CTED analytical brief. And many thanks to the panelists for the rich discussion, richer than, in fact, we all expected, I think. In addition to our normative work and analytical work, UNODC is mandated by the General Assembly to assist and support member states in building their capacity to implement effective AML-CFT frameworks. At this point in time, at the request of governments, most of our capacity building programs involve advising AML-CFT competent authorities on how to effectively partner with the private sector, including for more effective CFT implementation. Because of its criticality for security, financial stability, and inclusion objectives, UNODC strategically developed our consultation and collaboration with the private sector over the last years, including with the global heads of risk and compliance of the largest correspondent banks, money service and payments providers, fintech and regtech, and other entities such as social media and other payments providers. UNODC hosts the Private Sector Consultative Forum of FATF annually, and we hope to see CTED at this year's event. And we involve local private sector, including in the development of effective CFT frameworks for the delivery of large-scale humanitarian assistance that the UN agencies, funds, and programs deliver. For example, collaborating on the development of CFT indicators for payment solutions and remittance channels in complex and crisis situations. We are mandated to do this, and we have made this a regular element of our practical collaboration with the private sector on CFT assistance globally. We regularly advise member states on the purposes and modalities for PPPs, their legal and regulatory basis, and the human rights considerations involved. We are especially grateful that the analytical brief covers gaps and challenges identified in PPP frameworks. The findings are entirely consistent with our own discussions with both governments, financial institutions, and other private sector counterparts. Some of these challenges we have tried to deal with in our own work. For example, sustainability. Some countries increase the sustainability and nimbleness of PPPs by limiting them to very defined CFT task forces. Other countries address sustainability by providing for a standing partnership with a sound legal basis and a risk-based agenda. We observe that the perceived persistent oppositional relationship between government and private sector is diminishing in most countries. And I think I want to say specifically in small, low-income and very low-income countries. This is the UN's core constituency. And what we see in these countries is that the collaboration between private and public sector is usually already very well-founded, sometimes with private sector leading the public sector in understanding CFT risks and obligations. We do this including via facilitated dialogues, such as in the context of national risk assessments, FSRB action plans, and countering de-risking strategies. We think that these have had a demonstrably beneficial CFT impact, particularly in low-income and crisis-impacted countries. Important next steps for our technical assistance and for countries which have appropriate legal frameworks for PPPs is to ensure that the scope of participating private institutions is broad enough to reflect the local CFT risks and materiality. Also on our agenda is advising on the use of technology to make PPPs more efficient in the context of lower income countries and to use technology to ensure that they are human rights centered. Another point that I want to make is that the same challenges that the public sector is facing, such as speed of payments, the private sector is facing at exactly the same time. And so in order to address these, we facilitate that dialogue between private sector and public sector, and we found it to be very beneficial. And I think that echoes some of the statements that have been made here today. So thank you very much to CTED for the brief. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melissa, and also thank you for UN ODC, to UN ODC and the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, for maintaining and resuming the good practice of consulting with the private sector. The next private sector consultative forum held by the FATF will be, as tradition goes, hosted by UNODC in April, and we hope to contribute usefully to that as well. I will now turn the virtual floor to Mr. Faizo Numanai, Deputy Head on Anti-Terrorism Issues from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, to add some regional flair to the work with the member states on this topic.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Good evening from Vienna to all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Dear ASG German, distinguished panelists, discussants, participants, I'm honored to share how the OSCE is making a difference in the field of public-private partnerships in the context of countering financing of terrorism, which is a cornerstone of our wider counterterrorism effort. The OSCE, as the largest regional security organization, has a unique mandate to prevent and counter terrorism through promotion of a comprehensive engagement, including with civil society and the private sector. Crucial for national security, public-private partnerships play a significant role in countering the financing of terrorism. Leveraging the resources and expertise of both sectors is essential, while ensuring transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights within and across these partnerships. Our wide field presence in Central Asia and Southeastern Europe allows our organization to provide customized capacity building programs. Since 2017, we have been focusing on building robust domestic frameworks to prevent nefarious actors from moving, using, and storing funds for terrorist purposes while upholding human rights and the rule of law. We do this through long-term engagement with local actors. Just over the past 2.5 years, we organized no less than 32 training courses in Central Asia and Southeastern Europe on a wide range of specialized CFT topics, including analysis, investigations, disruption, and the use of targeted sanctions. We have identified numerous findings on the cooperation between the public and the private sector. I would highlight just 3. First, in the fight against terrorism in many jurisdictions, there is a lack of institutionalized cooperation mechanisms, such as memoranda of understanding or standard operating procedures between government agencies and the private sector. Second, we have also seen that very often trust and understanding for the other side needs to be built and sustained. Third, we need to be well aware of unintended consequences, as it was mentioned, such as the impact on the nonprofit sector, recalling that civil society plays an essential role in the prevention of terrorism. Civil society organizations contribute to monitoring and oversight efforts. Encouraging their active participation fosters more inclusive and democratic approaches to countering the financing of terrorism. And we at OSCE are addressing these aspects in our courses by facilitating direct contacts between various sectors. Still, we recognize that we need to do more. Therefore, soon we will be launching a new training course on cooperation with the private sector in the context of countering the financing of terrorism, underscoring OSCE's leadership role in delivering impactful and long-term assistance in the field of CFT. In conclusion, I encourage all of you to reach out to us in case of interest in our capacity building work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and also for sharing this information about your future work, as well as the long-standing cooperation in the past and present with us in assisting member states, specifically on those gaps and recommendations that stem from the assessments by the Counter-Terrorism Committee and CTED. We really appreciate this partnership. Now, I have a very brief comment on behalf of another regional organization that the representative could not say until this juncture, the Anti-Terrorism Center of the Commonwealth States, ATCIS. They are actually above other ways of cooperations, are also traditionally expanding our reports and publications to a Russian-speaking audience. And they're currently working on the translation of the brief that we're discussing today into Russian language. And we are very grateful for that completely complimentary and very much appreciated work. We have surprisingly reached the end of our planned interventions. And I really cannot thank you all enough, not only for the substance of all of the contributions made, but also for the cooperation in terms of time and focus of all the interventions. I think we really couldn't do better than we did. I now turn for a few minutes that we have left to first our in-room audience to see if there are any interventions, burning comments, but again, mindful of the fact that we have about 10 minutes for that exercise collectively. So if you have a comment or an intervention in the room, please make a sign with the hand. I don't see any. So while people online may be considering this opportunity, we did receive a question in the chat, which, by the way, was has a life of its own there, and I'm glad to see that people are communicating and discussing matters. So I'll summarize the question and then see if any other experts here can answer that. So it goes again to the concern related to privacy. Given the sheer volume of raw data we now have, what is the role of collective data leveraged anonymously via artificial intelligence to elucidate PF trends and patterns as they evolve? Would that enable us to only reveal private information as needed to investigate specific activity? It seems that anonymized data analyzed to reveal trends and behavioral insights could both protect private information and help make the process of identifying TF more precise, while also keeping all sectors on the same page in terms of evolving landscape. I'm first turning this way to our experts. If anybody wants to reflect on this issue on data, anonymized data, AI used for processing it, any concerns, any reflections here? Please, Dr. Shah. Pressure, sorry.
I think it goes back to no matter what data you're using, whether it's anonymized or not, you have to use the right data that's going to get you the right results for the model, right? There is a lot of work being done now, especially with the European Union passing its first AI Act and looking about data governance, right? So how do we ensure that we're building models that are responsible and on target? And so there really is a there's an overlap there as well. And so, whether it's anonymized or otherwise, yes, it's important to get it right. But I will say that, so AI right now has a lot of promise in the, AML CFT field in narrowing down and processing this huge volume of information. So it's not looked upon as a complete, like this solves all of our problems, but it definitely helps us narrow down those things, and so we can look at a smaller set of results.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate this response that's really on the spot and on point. I'm looking at our expert speakers online. If anybody has any comments in addition to that. Ian, yes, go ahead. I can see that.
Yeah, just a couple of points, and remember this is from a vendor perspective. So we collect a lot of data. Much of the technology that people deploy to monitor for unusual activity related to financial crime broadly, and of course terrorist financing specifically, is from vendors like us, is available through software as a service, which sort of means it naturally lends itself to an environment where data can be shared. Now, of course, all the data is appropriately protected, particularly the PII data. But I think to the earlier question, and obviously we need to always keep an eye on the how we're managing that data governance, and even things like I think Michelle mentioned sort of data governance, and there's guidance from like the OCC on how to manage the data and how to manage models appropriately. But there is a mechanism, and it's important to think about our group as a whole, as we talked about earlier on, because one of the comments I've had working with banks in the Midwest in the United States, for example, is I may be a $20 billion bank in assets under management, but I don't have the data that a Citibank has or a large bank has. How do I make the appropriate inference for financial crime, given that I'm only seeing a small amount of data? Well, one of the ways of achieving better inference, better actionable insights on the data, is to share data. Now, the point is for vendors like us, the type of data that can be shared are the indicators in the data. So take out the PII data, but really look for those trends in the data and those typologies and those illicit flows, and use that and try and share that data as much as possible. So I think that's the sort of journey that we're on, because the other thing we have to worry about is not only protecting the data appropriately, not only making sure that we've got models that aren't including bias, for example, but also we need to figure out how we can actually sort of use that data to achieve our sort of ultimate goal.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I can see that we have another hand raised online. I understand it's an intervention from Mark from ABN AMRO Bank. We're clearly in the Netherlands today. Please go ahead. I hope you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so now I can unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think I've indicated most of what I wanted to say in the chat. But as I said to the gentleman from the Human Rights, I think, also from the Netherlands, I'm very willing and want to engage. I am a very adamant admirer of the GDPR that we have in place, which, by the way, allows where there is legal cause to actually share data. So we are absolutely have been waiting for legislation that where our local privacy authority advised us to go and get new legislation. We did so at the Netherlands level. Unfortunately, that is still stuck in Parliament. But if you look at the AMLR, it already meets our needs exactly. And I would like to point out that there is indeed a very important privacy aspect. And as I said, I'm very adamant about that. But I'm also adamant about protecting human rights against human trafficking, against all kinds of other elements, not just terrorism, but that really destroys people's lives. And I really want to engage with anyone who wants to have a discussion about one of the things that was raised about the proportionality. Well, I really can speak about the proportionality of an individual whose payments are shared under privacy shielding, and that process is audited. There's no looking at data that does not alert from the models that we have gone through model governance. And only where under the model governance there's a reason to look at something is that transaction and that client account returned to the original bank. And so the original bank is the one that sees all of the information anyway. They just are targeted to the appropriate client. And as a bank, we are a commercial organization. We want to service all of our clients to the best of our ability. And we have absolutely the presumption of innocence that prosecution may not always have. We really believe that that's the case. And I believe someone as the chair pointed out that in the Netherlands, we're having roundtables with each of the sectors from a business client perspective, but also with the consumer organizations to discuss what we're doing. And as I say in the chat, we have an ethical committee. We're audited on an annual basis, not audited for financial reasons, but audited for the correct application of the mitigations that we have identified in our DPIA. And that is, unfortunately, the proportionality is indeed the challenge that has been raised against TMNL. And my argument is that you should only look at the proportionality after the PET shielding has been lifted, where the data is back at the original bank. So no one sees the data that could not have seen it in the first place. And the proportionality is about the alerts that are raised. And actually, the alerts often are regarding human trafficking, wildlife trade, the serious crime. And one of the new discussions that has happened in the Netherlands is that we should not look at petty crime, but we should only look at serious crime. And I think that is something that we can really implement easier with such a controlled utility that we have, rather than each of the banks fending for themselves and having more difficulty trying to do their best. But each of them, with the example of the Midwestern banks, not having sufficient capacity to actually implement procedures the way that we can in a joint effort. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity as a bystander to add my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this intervention. I think this brings us to the end of today's discussion, but clearly this discussion is a launch as the title of the event goes, and we will continue to be engaged. Before I pass on to our Chief of Branch for the closing remarks, just a reminder that, again, a lot of reports and publications have been mentioned today. If they are not already in the chat, they will all be referenced on the web page on our site, where we will summarize the outcomes of the event, put the link to the recording of the event, and reference all the important publications and analytical reports. With that, I pass on to Mr. Derek Charrier, Chief of Branch Director at CTED.
Thank you, Svetlana, and thank you, everyone. It will be extremely difficult for me to add value to this very rich conversation because so much has been covered. It will be even very difficult to try to summarize. So what I will try to do, and probably in less than 15 minutes that was allocated to it, is to zoom out a little bit and try to share with you how we see the conversation today with our broader engagement on these issues. So one thing that came very clearly from this conversation and other conversations we had on the links between technology and counterterrorism is the immense and growing gap between technology and the immense pace in which it runs and attempts to govern it, either at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. Technology moves extremely fast. Governance, regulation, and enforcement are moving much, much slower. And one of the most important tools that we have in order to try to narrow the gap is public-private partnerships. Because we, on the side of the UN or the side of governments, learning the technology, but no one knows better the technology as well as any vulnerabilities that may exist in it than the private sector. And for this, we need true partnership. And what we're seeing today was a wonderful example of such partnerships. So I want to first be thankful to all of you who came, to the many people who registered and participated online, because this partnership is critical. It was therefore also not surprising that the CTC, the body of the UN Security Council body that CTED reports to, saw this issue, relations between technology and counterterrorism, as a key challenge, and decided in 2022, at the end of 22, to hold a very important meeting in Delhi, in which 3 such technologies were discussed. One of them, of course, is CFT, but other tracks followed: developments in UAS, drones, and developments in ICT, Internet and Communication Technology challenges. And this meeting culminated in a Delhi declaration, and one of the elements of it was a request for all member states to strengthen those partnerships and for CTED to be able to support them in this regard. And this meeting served extremely well for us to be able to understand the challenges, to understand what works, what can be improved. And the report that was produced by our wonderful team, Kana and Preeti, under the wonderful leadership of Svetlana, is an example of how much we can support, how much we can contribute, and how much we can understand what's going on. The Delhi Declaration also asks CTED to deepen its engagement with the private sector and to better understand what can work well in this space. And we are grateful again for all of you who came, and hope that this meeting will serve as an opportunity to deepen our partnership with all stakeholders from the private sector, from civil society, from banks, from governments and international and regional organizations. One last thing that this meeting can also serve, and again, an opportunity to be grateful to all of you, is the request from the CTC in that Delhi declaration to develop, with the support of CTED, a set of non-binding guiding principles on the 3 areas that I mentioned. At the end of 2023, the CTC adopted the first set of guiding principles on the issue of drones. It was very thoroughly negotiated, and now the road is clear for the CTC to start its negotiations on the second set, which will be CFT and technology. The discussion today will certainly enrich that conversation. Many of you participated in many of the lead-up and follow-up meetings to the Delhi Declaration, in which many of the issues discussed here were also discussed there. And what I really want to hope is that as the CTC starts these negotiations, we will be able to rely on your expertise and the partnership that we developed with all of you in order to allow this instrument also to be adopted in the very near future. So thank you very much to everyone. And we still have 10 minutes for some networking. If any of you want, and I'm sure you want to network with each other. And thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, ASG, German, and good luck to all of us.